need light on.
Is your age. So he tells the son, he goes to the front door, appears out there, there's no one out there, he closes the door. Well, up until this point, he had been keeping this door locked. Because he felt like nothing's gonna happen. But that night, he starts knocking. For the next couple of weeks is when they started to hear this banging sound at the front door, like if someone was there. And when the father would go and answer the door, there would be no one there. And eventually, the father gets so frustrated and angry with whoever's knocking at the door that one night he hears the knocking. He goes to the front door, he opens it, and he goes out on the porch and he starts screaming, what are you doing at my house? Like, leave us alone, leave my family alone, like, quit. And all of a sudden, he hears his name being called, and it sounds like a child's voice, and it's telling him to come out into the woods. And so his father makes his way back inside, closes the door, and locks it. And at this point, he's like, in the Appalachian. All the cryptids, one that is Jersey Devil. All the cryptids, one that is Jersey Devil, because there have thousands of Jersey Devil.
Yeah, sounded like a rock song. That's fun.
Which is something. So she goes outside of the RV and she's yelling to her dogs, like, come here, like, where are you? And she said she could see her two dogs in front of her, but she sees up in the sky this black shadowy figure just come down, take her dog and pick it up and carry it off into the air. And at the time, she said she thought it was like an owl, a large bird or something. So she's freaking out. She's screaming like, her dog's name. She gets the other dog, puts him in the RV. She calls for her boyfriend, and they go out in the woods and they're looking for this dog. They cannot find it anywhere. The next day, they go back out into the woods to look for this dog. They notice this one tree, there's like red stuff running down it. Well, they look up in the tree, and there is the dog. And it has been ripped apart into two pieces, and it's hanging from the tree. They said this was a German Shepherd. It was, 98 pounds. So whatever it was had to be very big that carried this thing off, right? So after that, she was very cautious with leaving the dogs out at night. She didn't like to be outside at night. And she said a few nights she would, come home later at night and she was bringing some groceries in. And she would hear strange sounds like screams coming from the woods, and she would hurry up and run inside the RV. But she said the creepiest encounter with this thing was one night her and her boyfriend are asleep in the RV. And she said she had this very vivid dream. And she said standing in her bedroom there was this tall creature that had the legs of like a horse, had sort of the face kind of a man, had these big long horns protruding from its head, had these sharp teeth, had red eyes. And this thing just looked at her and said, "Hello, Deborah." And she said, right as it said, "Hello, Deborah," she woke up. Well, when she wakes up, she thinks like, oh, it was just like a bad nightmare. Well, she hears what sounds like something moving on top of the RV. She wakes her boyfriend up and she's like, there's something on top of the RV. And they could hear what sounded like footsteps, but like if it was a horse kind of trotting on top of this RV.
And she said all of a sudden they heard this unhumanly scream. And then, boom, whatever this was, it just sort of flew off. The next day, she said she went on top of the RV with a ladder. And she looked up on the top of the RV and could see what looked like dirt impressions of hoof prints. So several months pass, and they kept having these weird encounters. And she said this night something just didn't feel right. And she said that her and her boyfriend were watching TV in the RV when all of a sudden something just hits the side of the RV. And she said it was so hard that stuff actually fell off the shelf. And she said then they started hearing these loud screams, and there was something outside of the RV, and it was kind of, flying around like low, that they could see it out the window. So her boyfriend jumps in the driver's seat, starts it up, and starts driving away. And they said as they were driving, they hear a loud smashing sound on the top of the RV. Like this thing was trying to get in the top of, the RV. So her boyfriend just pushed on the gas pedal and went as fast as he can. And he said after about 5 miles, whatever this was, left. And they managed to go to a friend's house. And when they get out, they could tell something was sort of had thrashed the outside of the RV because it was badly damaged. And Debbie said she would never go back to the Pine Barrens again. All the cryptids, a lot of people wonder why they say in the Appalachians not to go into the woods at night, not to whistle, not to sing, and always make sure you close your windows and you lock your doors, and absolutely never respond to anything that calls your name. So this goes back to an old Native American belief in the area that these mountains were home to spirits and that they would come out and wander during the night. And I've heard 2 stories that will give you an idea as to why you should not do these things at night. So there was a man named Jeff. He lived outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. And he was told about this spot up in the mountains where there was some good mushrooms. But no one would go to this area because they were very superstitious. So Jeff thinks, I'm going to go to this area and get a good haul. And, what do I care? There's no such thing as ghost. So he goes out, he parks his car, he goes into the woods, and he's hunting for several hours. He starts to notice the sun is going down, it's getting dark. It's time to head back to his vehicle. Now, as he's walking through the woods, he all of a sudden hears, Jeff, come here. Come, Jeff. And he hears his name being called. So Jeff knows from legend that if you hear something calling your name, you do not respond. So he just keeps on walking. And all of a sudden, he hears this louder and louder, his name being called. And then he starts hearing screaming coming from deep in the woods. And he hears laughter, and he hears what sounds like people just talking all around him. So he starts walking faster and faster. And he knows the way he came in, but for some reason, it feels like the trees are almost moving, and he is going in the wrong direction now. And finally, he comes out sort of to this open area, and he sees a man standing out in this field, but he's turned around looking in the opposite direction. So Jeff goes up and approaches this guy and says, "Excuse me, sir, do you know the route back to the highway?" And when this man turns around, Jeff realizes that it's himself, and he's all bloody and bruised, and he's just staring back at him. So Jeff runs as fast as he can for several miles, gets in his car, and drives back home. Later that night, he's awoken to hearing voices inside his room calling out to him, "Jeff, come back, come." And so Jeff never went back into the woods again, mushroom hunting. And the second story I've heard is there was a couple who decided they were going to live in the Appalachian Mountains for a summer. They find this cabin for rent, and they're surprised at how cheap the price is for 6 months. So they rent this cabin, and they go out there and they bring all their stuff to move in. And this guy in a truck, he meets them out there, and he's very nervous. And he tells them, "Hey, at night, you're going to want to lock your doors and close the blinds." And then he gets in his truck and he leaves as fast as he can. So this couple is just in awe of how nice this log cabin is, and the fact that they got it for almost, this huge steal. So that night they go into their cabin, they make themselves comfortable. It gets dark, and all of a sudden they hear a thump, thump, thump up on the roof. And it sounds like something or someone is walking across the roof. And then they hear banging on the side of the house, and they hear these large booms and creaks and sounds coming all around them from outside. It sounds almost like their house is being invaded. Eventually, the sound dies down and daylight comes. The next day, same thing happens. And for several weeks, this goes on. So finally, the husband is fed up, and he says, "You know what? I'm done. We're taking our home back. We're tired of being harassed." So in the middle of the night, when this sounds start happening again, he goes to the window, he opens the curtains, and then he looks out the window, and standing out behind the window is a woman. And she has this pale, long face and white, gray hair going over her shoulders. And he notices she has solid white eyes, and she's just staring at him. And then she points directly at him, and that's when all hell breaks loose. He starts hearing banging on the roof, banging on the sides of the house. The house feels like almost like an earthquake is happening. And then he shuts the blinds. They run into the bathroom, and they hide for the rest of the night. The next day, they decide, we're through with this, and they leave, never to return again. A lot of people wonder why an Appalachian skinwalker is much different than the Navajo skinwalker. Okay, the first difference is that a Navajo skinwalker, right, is conjured up by a medicine man, whereas an Appalachian skinwalker is conjured up by a witch in the Appalachia who uses black magic. The other big difference between the Appalachian skinwalker versus the native skinwalker is that the Appalachian skinwalker tends to take the form of objects, and a lot of time almost just comes as an invisible force that calls out to people or follows them. Or, for instance, the Bell Witch, right? It wasn't a witch going after that family. It was a skinwalker that was conjured up to harm and, terrify that family. So I got a story for you. This is a true story now, and I'm going to show you a picture as well. So there's a man named Donald. Donald was an avid hunter and trapper. He lived near the North Carolina-Tennessee border up in the Appalachian Mountains. And one day, he's out hunting, and he's in the middle of the woods. And he set up, in this deer stand. And he'd been out there all day, and he's, had been hunting for the whole week, so he was getting tired. He falls asleep and dozes off. Well, when he awakes, it's now nighttime and it's gotten dark. And as he's adjusting some things in his tree stand, all of a sudden, whoosh, he hears this loud thing move over the top of him through the trees, like it's some kind of large bird or something. And he thinks it's odd because, he hasn't seen, birds that big in that area. But then once again, whoosh, right? This big thing just passes over the top of him through the trees, and it's shaking all the branches. And then again, a third time. So, he gets down off his tree stand and is like, okay, it's time to head back to camp. As he starts, walking this trail back to camp, all of a sudden he hears something, say, Donald, Donald, hey, Donald, come play, and this voice, it just keeps calling to him. And he, is like freaking out. He's terrified. So he takes off running, and he's running as fast as he can. And all of a sudden, boom, he trips and he rolls. And he realizes he just tripped over this root that is sticking out of the ground. And when he looks up, he notices this big, eerie-looking tree. And, it has no leaves on it, but it has branches that almost look like hands, and it looks like it has a face. And this tree starts staring at him and opens its eyes, and he can see that this tree has taken some kind of physical, like humanly form, and it starts reaching its branches down, and it grabs Donald and it picks him up and is shaking him and whipping him with the other branches. Well, Donald still manages to hold on to his rifle, and he just starts firing at the tree. And he manages to hit one of the branches that was holding his leg, and it basically breaks, and he falls to the ground. So he runs back to his cabin, and he gets inside, and he locks all the doors. And all night long, he can hear the tree lashing at the house, trying to get in. And the next morning, all is calm. But he notices outside, there's the tree. It has moved. It's next to the cabin. And he manages to take some pictures, which actually show the face in the tree. And this is the picture that Donald took. An Appalachian skinwalker is much different than the Navajo skinwalker. Okay, the first difference is that
every night the wife would
Superstition Mountains is this very creepy. The years it Yeah, most terrifying legend that I ever heard was that of the Stick Indian. Now, the Stick, you have to understand that when you go into the Appalachian Mountains, you are entering into another realm. And there is a set of unspoken rules that you must follow. Rule number one, if you hear something calling your name, right, you didn't. There is nothing there. And you should not respond. Do not say hello. Do not say, who is it? Just run away. Because something is trying to gain permission. And by you acknowledging it, you are allowing it to come after you. If you hear screams in the mountains, right? You didn't. And do not go towards the direction of the screams to try and help. Because once again, something is trying to lure you. If you see people, you don't. If you hear crying, you're not hearing it. Do not respond to this at all because you are giving permission to whatever is in those woods to come after you. Now, if you are to go camping in the Appalachian Mountains, right? You have to remember, at night, you must keep a fire going at all times. And it's not for warmth, it's not for cooking, it's to keep you safe. And if you are going to camp in a tent, make sure when you go into that tent, it is sealed up. There are no holes, there are no cracks. And if you hear any kind of screaming, yelling, or anyone calling your name, do not respond. Do not go to sleep. And if something wakes you up, stay alert, and once again, do not respond. Now, it's very important when you are walking through the Appalachian Mountains, if you come across a deer carcass, do not touch it, do not stare at it, walk away, ignore it, because this is something, once again, trying to lure you into the woods. Now, if it comes to the point that something is chasing you and it gets you and there is no escape, fight as hard as you can, whether it's a person, an animal. If it's something else though, and you know what I'm talking about, well, you just let it get you, right? Because at that point, there's nothing you can do. And there's an old saying, you go into the Appalachian Mountains with 2 bullets, right? You fire the first one at something that isn't a person, that isn't an animal. And if it doesn't run away, you know what to do with the second one. You have to understand that when you go into the Appalachian Mountain, a lot of people wonder why they say in the Appalachians not to go into the woods at night, not to whistle, not to sing, and always make sure you close your windows and you lock your doors, and absolutely never respond to anything that calls your name. So this goes back to an old Native American belief in the area that these mountains were home to spirits and that they would come out and wander during the night. And I've heard 2 stories that will give you an idea as to why you should not do these things at night. So there was a man named Jeff. He lived outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. And he was told about this spot.
These women took turns.
It's a good reason why people close their curtains at night in the Appalachian Mountains. There are things in those woods that are terrifying. And one of those things happened to be the Appalachian Wendigo. Now, there was this man named Jim. Jim decided one day that he was going to sell everything he had and buy some acreage of land in the Appalachian Mountains and start this homestead. This story comes out of Missouri. There was this man named Phil, and he said this one weekend, him and his wife decided to go camping in the Ozarks. They had this area that they would go to, which was a friend's property, and they had kind of set up like this cleared area where they could camp for the weekend. So they go there, they set up their tents and everything, and he's enjoying his time with his wife. Well, he said later that night they go to bed and they are in their tent when he just like has this really bad dream. And in the dream, there is something like running through the woods and it's chasing him. And he said all of a sudden this thing turns and it starts going after his wife. And then boom, he wakes up. And he said when he woke up, he looked over and his wife was gone. She wasn't in the tent. So he starts freaking out like what's going on? Like, where's my wife? So he got up and goes outside of the tent and he starts yelling for his wife. An Appalachian skinwalker is much different than the Navajo skinwalker. There is a Superstition Mountains is so. This is probably you have to understand that when you scariest case to come out. One of the creepiest encounters with Dogman was a story I heard out of West Virginia. Now, there was this man named Fred. Fred owned a farm and several acres of land. And he said he started to notice that he was losing livestock to something. And he said at the time he thought maybe a bear, maybe a mountain lion, but whatever this was, it kept coming back. He said one night, him and his wife wake up and they hear sort of a banging sound at their back door. So he gets up, he goes to the back door, there's nothing there. And he said, for several months, every night something kept waking them up being at the back door. Well, he said one night he happened to be in his barn and he was working on his tractor. And he said all of a sudden his dog runs into the barn and just hides and is scared of something. He said he kept trying to get his dog to come out, but he was like terrified. So he's like, okay, whatever, just stay there. So he went back to working on his tractor and he said out of the corner of his eye, next to the door, he sees a shadow of something run by. So he goes up to the door, he looks out, he doesn't see anything. He goes back to work on his tractor, and he said the next thing he knows is he was bending over, he feels something grabbing his leg, and when he looks down, he said there was a hand sticking through a hole in the barn, grabbing his leg. He said it was covered in fur, and it had these long, sharp nails. He said he hit it with this wrench that he had, and whatever it was let go. He runs outside of the barn, and he looks to, where this creature or whatever it was would have been. And he said there was nothing there. So he searched the whole entire area. And he said he couldn't get his dogs to pursue this, whatever it was, and they were terrified. About a couple months later, he said, one night, as usual, he hears something messing with the back door. Except this time, when he comes out to the back door, he actually notices this tall, wolf-like creature staring at him through the window, and he takes this photograph. And he said right after he took the photograph, whatever it was, just took off running and ran into the woods behind his house. And he said still to this day, he has livestock go missing, but he has no idea what this thing is. One of the creepiest encounters with Dawn, man. This story comes out of central Illinois. There was this man named Jack, and Jack said when he was younger, him and his friend were playing out in the woods. And he said they came across this pond in the middle of the forest. And he said when they got to the shoreline, they looked out and there was like a little island in the middle of the pond with a couple trees. Now Jack noticed his friend started getting like really nervous. And he said his friend was like, look, we gotta go, we gotta get out of here. And he's like, why, what's wrong? And he's like, come on, we gotta leave. So his friend, took off and just started heading back into town. So he follows his friend and they go all the way back to his house. He goes inside and his friend tells his dad, like, hey dad, I found that place you were talking about with the pond and the island in the middle. And his dad was like, what? Are you guys okay? Like, is everything all right? And Jack's like, what's wrong? And his dad's like, nothing. Just don't ever go back to that place. Don't ever go there. And he said, like, his dad would never talk about, like, why they shouldn't go there. So later on in life, Jack said he was about 25. And at this time, he was living in his car. And he said, he would park at places around town, but he kept getting told to leave. So he remembered that spot out in the woods, that there was this little dirt road that would take you, far out into the woods, right by where this pond was. And he said, you know what, I bet I could park there, I could sleep there, and no one would disturb me. So he drives his car out to this spot. It's about 9-10 o'clock at night. He said he rolled down his window and he started smoking a cigarette. He said all of a sudden, like a breeze of wind started to pick up, and he caught wind of this very bad smell. And he said it just smelled like, kind of like rotten eggs. And he said when the breeze would stop, the smell would stop, but as the breeze picked up, it would come back again. And he said after a while, he started hearing what he thought at the time were sounds of coyotes. And he said he just kept hearing like this howling sound. Well, he didn't think much of it, and he starts getting tired. So he gets in the back of his car, and he puts a pillow down, puts a blanket on, and he falls asleep. Well, he said, it was a really nice night, so he had the windows partly rolled down, letting the breeze in. And he said he just remembers waking up to this weird feeling on his ankle. And he said when he looked down, there was a hand that was covered in hair grabbing his leg. And he said when he looked up out the window, he could see the face of a wolf, but like a body of a hairy man. And he said there were two bright yellow eyes just staring at him. He said this thing grabbed his ankle and started trying to pull him out of the back of the car. He's screaming and yelling, trying to fight this thing and kicking as hard as he can. Finally, this thing lets up. He gets up to the front of the car and he starts the engine and he starts taking off. Well, he said this thing still had its arm in the window, and he starts dragging it along the road with him, and it's trying to actually get inside the car. And then he said finally it just kind of broke off and it like rolled and then took off into the woods. And he said he, was like terrified. He's speeding down this dirt road and he said all of a sudden he noticed standing on the side of the road up ahead, there was this woman with like long black hair. And he said she was just standing there staring at him driving by. And he said she was covered in some kind of white paint with these black markings all over her. And he said he just like something about her just felt very, very off. But he kept driving and she just stared at him as he drove past. So he said, you know, he got back into town and stuff and he was pretty freaked out. He calls up his old friend that he had the experience with when he was younger. And he says, hey, you know that spot with the pond and the island out there? Like, why did you get so freaked out? And he goes, well, you know, my dad said that there used to be like this satanic cult that lived there. And they would do all this, you know, black magic ritual type stuff. And he said like strange stuff would happen in that area and people would disappear all the time. And he said when my dad was younger, he's seen what he still swears to this day was a half man, half wolf. This story comes out of central Illinois. There was this man named Jack, and Jack's This story comes out of Missouri. There was this man named Phil, and he said this one weekend, him and his wife decided to go camping in the Ozarks. They had this area that they would go to. This story takes place outside of Chicago, Illinois. There was this older gentleman. He was driving one night on a rural highway outside of Chicago, and he said there was nothing but cornfields and a few houses here and there, but he was completely alone. He said there was no other cars on the road. So, you know, he started to get bored. He turned on his radio. And as he's listening to his radio, he said, you know, like the radio started to go haywire. And it was changing stations by itself, and it was turning off and on. And he had no clue as to what was happening. So all of a sudden he heard a put, 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 put sound, and his car broke down. He managed to veer over into the shoulder, and he gets on his phone. He calls a tow truck. Now, as he's sitting in his car, he said he heard a loud banging sound on the driver's side window. When he looks out the window, he sees a group of teenagers all wearing these black hoodies that are, you know, covering their face to where he couldn't see them. And they are moving kind of erratically on the side of the vehicle. So he slightly rolls down his window and he's like, yeah, can I help you? And he said one of these teenagers was like, give us a ride. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like, my car's broke down. And they're like, listen, man, give us a ride. And he said like they had this just weird, deep, kind of piercing voice. And he said, no, get away from my car. Like, you guys need to leave now. The tow truck's coming. Like, there's going to be people here, so you need to back away. And he said after that, they started to get kind of angry, and they were kind of like taunting him and calling him names and stuff like that and yelling at him and telling him to get out of the vehicle. And he just kept saying, you know, get away from my car, someone's coming. Well, all of a sudden, he said one of these teenagers jumps up on the hood of his car and starts bouncing up and down, and they're screaming and making these weird sounds. So he looks in the back seat and he finds like a tire iron, And he goes out of his vehicle and he's like, look, get off my car right now. You kids need to leave. Like, get out of here, like, or there's going to be problems. And he said all of them sort of started huddling around him and trying to get close. And he said they just started mocking him and laughing. And one of them picked up rocks and started hitting him with these small little stones. And they told him, you're all alone. You're out here all alone. Like, no one's going to hear you. No one's going to find you. And he started to get freaked out. He noticed, though, when he looked down, none of them were wearing any shoes. Like, they were barefoot, which was weird because there was snow on the ground. It was like freezing cold, yet they were all barefoot. He said one of them then approached him from the side, and when he turned, he kind of swung the tire iron. And as he swung, he said he looked and could see now this teenager's face. And he said, you know, it just had almost like a pale white, rubbery looking skin with these solid black eyes. And he knew something was off. So he said he dropped the tire iron and he took off running as fast as he could. They started chasing after him and they were screaming and shouting, like throwing rocks at him. And he's like, you know, for sure they're gonna get me, they're gonna get me. But he manages to find like a house. He runs up to the door, he starts banging on the door. This old man answers, and he says, like, I'm being chased by these teenagers, like, I need your help. So he said the guy went inside, grabbed a firearm, and he went out, and they started trying to find these teenagers. They couldn't find them anywhere. And he said the weird thing was, when he got back to his vehicle, and the guy was with him, they could not find any sort of footprints to show that like they were even there or which way they had went. So he got back in his car, and when the tow truck finally arrived, like he was glad to be out of there. And he said he knew that what he encountered that day was not human. This story takes place outside of Chicago, Illinois. There was this older gentleman. He was driving one night on a rural highway outside of Chicago, and he said there was nothing but cornfields and a few houses here and there. This story takes place outside of Chicago, Illinois. There was this older gentleman. He was driving one night on a rural highway outside of Chicago. This story takes place outside of Chicago, Illinois. There was this older gentleman. He was driving one night on a rural highway outside of Chicago. This story takes place outside of Chicago, Illinois. There was this older gentleman. He was driving one night on a rural highway outside of Chicago. This story takes place outside of Chicago, Illinois. There was this older gentleman. He was driving one night on a rural highway outside of Chicago. This story takes place outside of Chicago, Illinois. There was this older gentleman. He was driving one night on a rural highway outside of Chicago. This story takes place outside of Chicago, Illinois. There was this older gentleman. He was driving one night on a rural highway outside of Chicago, and he said there was nothing but cornfields and a few houses here and there, but he was completely alone. He said there was no other cars on the road. So, you know, he started to get bored. He turned on his